morning, this is Bob Tremblay. Welcome to another edition of Baystste Backcountry. Right now it is April in central Massachusetts, and today we're going to be going hiking in Leominster State Forest, and specifically we're going to visit a section of the forest that was once, during the 1700s, early 1800s, was once a small farming community that called itself No Town. So we're going to be seeing some of the remnants of No Town, but specifically we're going to hike in to see two cellar holes, both having to do with Joeseph Palmer, who was a bit of a historical figure who was involved with the whole transcendental movement in the late 1700s, early 1800s, and was a contemporary of Louisa May Alcott and Ralph Waldo Emerson and some of those folks. So we're going to go in there, hike into the wilderness, and see where Joeseph Palmer was born, and then where he lived later in life. And then we'll talk a little bit more about this very interesting character in early American history. So I'm excited to get out there. The weather's holding, the forest is just coming alive after the winter, and I'm going to head out to No Town in the Leominster State Forest. So here we are on the end of Mount Elam Road in Leominster, and as I can see right here, is the pavement ends literally right here, and now the road turns into a fire road entering the forest that the city of Leominster owns and protects for the watershed of No Town Reservoir. No Town Reservoir is the public water supply for the city of Leominster. It's called No Town Reservoir because the reservoir sits on the site of what was once part of the community of No Town. So I'm going to access the fire road here to get into the woods and see some of the remnants, the cellar holes, and the history of No Town. So this entire forest was once a community, as I've been talking about, called No Town. And I'll kind of talk about the history of No Town in a little bit. But where I am right now, behind me, I just came in on Mount Elam Road, and I am approaching the intersection of Mount Elam Road and Granite Street in Leominster. So that way, Mount Elam, we don't hit pavement for maybe half a mile. This way up here on Granite Street, we don't hit pavement for maybe a mile and a quarter, something like that. But where I am right now, this is the intersection of Mount Elam and Granite Street. And what's significant about this is, here's my destination right here, is at this intersection I have a very interesting cellar hole, and let me climb down inside of it. All right, so this cellar hole was the foundation for a home that was built sometime, I would guess, was probably built around 1785 or so. And this is where the family, the Palmers, lived. And Joeseph Palmer, who really was a very unique historical figure, was born and raised here at this home site. And so I'm always kind of particularly proud of this particular cellar hole. There are many out here in No Town. But I'm always kind of proud of this because in 1992, when I owned my company, Mountain Links Outdoor Adventures, for Earth Day of 1992, we organized a huge cleanup of the Leominster State Forest. And with all our volunteers for that cleanup, we actually picked up 28 tons of trash. And this particular cellar hole, back then in 1992, was filled with old paint cans and tires. So where I'm standing, the paint cans and the tires were above my head. And so we had gotten permission from the state. We opened the gate down there, we drove some trucks in here, and I had volunteers taking all this trash out of this historic cellar hole. So this is where the Palmer family lived. So their home was here. This is the foundation. The home was built up on top of it. And across the way, they actually had I think they had a barn at one time, they had fields, and when they were living here, this was a very remote wilderness dwelling. This is one of the key families of the Knowtown area. So little Joseph Palmer was born here in 1791, and the Palmer family was one of the founding families of Knowtown. And so the history of Knowtown is that after the American Revolutionary War, the veterans of the war were deeded grants of land, 40-acre lots. And basically what the state of Massachusetts did is they had their map and they just looked at the blank areas and they drew squares on it, and they awarded, those are 40-acre squares, they gave those to the veterans. So the Palmers were one of those founding families, and they came out here, they had their deeded acreage, they dug out this foundation, they built the house, the Palmers raised a family, and Joseph Palmer grew up here. The settlement was made up, all these 40-acre grid pattern parcels was made up of all these Revolutionary War vets who were coming out here, and they're basically homesteading. And one of the things that kind of worked against them, it was always a very rugged area out here. It's a lot of stone, tough place to make a living. They had no community services. And one of the things that was especially challenging for them was because the area was laid out as a grid, they never had a town common. And traditionally our New England towns are all kind of built around a common area where the town hall and the church and civic centers are. And this settlement never had that. And so after a couple of decades of survival and living out here, the people of this settlement petitioned the city of Fitchburg to see if they could be incorporated into the city of Fitchburg. Fitchburg told them, denied their request because they're just so far and remote that it would just be too much of an extension for Fitchburg to provide them with services. So then the people out here petitioned the city of Leominster in the same way, and they got the same rebuttal. So the people, because there was no town that was willing to incorporate them, the people ended up naming their settlement Knowtown because no town wanted them. And so they hung on for a couple of generations, and there are scattered cellar holes like this. Very often you can find a cellar hole. Often nearby there's a well. You can often also see nearby where a barn may have been, or paddocks for livestock. There was a factory out here that built furniture. There was a school, and there was a church. But everything was spread far apart because there was never that common area. And so finally, out of that hardship, is the people here of this settlement basically abandoned it and left. And it grew back into a wilderness as we see now. But where I'm going to go now, this is where Joseph Palmer was born. But after leaving home, he moved up the hill, up Granite Street here, and he built another home of his own where he lived as an adult. And we will see is that his home that he lived as an adult was bigger than where he grew up as a child. So I'm going to head up Granite Street here to head up towards Joseph Palmer's adulthood home in the settlement of Knowtown. So this area really holds a real special place in my own personal history. This area here, as I'm walking up Granite Street, the power lines end up going over the crest of the hill here, and where the power lines go through the woods, they cut a swath through the forest, and beneath the power lines, these are all blueberry bushes. And as a child, from the time I was probably 6 years old, is in the summers, myself, my father, my grandfather, my younger brother, is we would hike up here in July, bringing buckets with us, and we would pick blueberries here, spending all day just filling our pails with blueberries. And that was a real special experience for me to be out here with my dad and my grandfather, gathering blueberries like that. And that's really what got me started my interest in hiking and backpacking and eventually all the outdoor adventuring that I do. So this area here is really special to me, and I'm thrilled to be here and kind of sharing it with you and a little bit about the history of the area as well. Oh, this is exciting. Whenever we see wildlife, that's when it really makes me excited to be in the outdoors. And right over here, climbing this pine tree, is we can see we have a porcupine. And he's going up there to try to avoid us. Porcupines are rodents related to, similar to rats and to mice and to beavers. And what porcupines do, you can see him climbing the tree right now. They're very good climbers. He has long claws. They eat the twigs and the soft wood at the tops of trees. So they're kind of like beavers. Beavers eat the same stuff, but beavers have to cut the tree down in order to get their food. Porcupines climb up to it. And contrary to popular belief, porcupines do not throw their quills. His quills are barbed and they're hollow and they're very sharp. And if we were to touch them, or if he were to swing his tail at us, those quills would stick at us and cause us a great deal of pain. But they cannot throw them. It's literally just very specialized hairs. And just as we can't throw our hair, they can't throw their hair either. But that's his main defense. And because their quills are so effective at defending them, they're not very smart and they're not very vicious. They don't have to be. But anyway, he is going where he's safest right now. He's going up the tree. I'm not going to disturb him at all. And you know, it's just great to know that the critters are out here, even though we don't always see them. So here we are. I've arrived at the cellar hole of Joeseph Palmer's adulthood home. So I'll just walk in here and get into the foundation. Coming through this way, everything's kind of, the forest is overgrown. This large granite slab right here, this was the front stoop of the front door. So this would have been the entrance of the home right here. And here's the collapsed walls and foundation. We still have one corner that's still very intact. Alright. So, this is our destination, Joe Palmer's home. So, Joeseph Palmer was born in 1790 down in the other foundation that we saw previously. And though I don't know for a fact, I imagine that his folks, or at least his dad, was a Revolutionary War vet, because that's how everybody here got their land. So growing up down the hill there, he very likely went to school over the top of the rise where we just were, where the blueberry fields are. And then as a young adult, he came here and he built his home here. And so when he had his home here, it was bigger than his parents' place. You can kind of see the really great construction of the walls here. What's kind of collapsed behind me, these are the blocks where his fireplace would have been. And then surrounding us here are all the stone fences where his fields were marked off. And he had a reputation too. He had a couple of paddocks over here we'll take a look at as well, where he used to keep stray animals. So other people whose sheep and cattle had wandered away, they would come here, and Joeseph Palmer would have them kind of almost like the animal control for No Town. But where Joeseph Palmer is really well known, and you should look him up on Wikipedia, is that after being a successful farmer and living out here until around 1830, he ended up moving to Fitchburg. And when he went to Fitchburg, Joeseph Palmer wore a long beard. And at that particular point in time in New England, in Fitchburg and Leominster and the towns around here, is wearing a beard was not fashionable. And in fact, it was so unfashionable that Joeseph Palmer was persecuted in Fitchburg to the point where he was thrown in the Worcester jail for a year. He was jailed for a year because he would not shave his beard. Eventually he got out of jail. He kept journals and kept records of just how much he was mistreated while he was in jail. And then after that, he fell into the whole group that included Emerson and Louisa May Alcott and these other transcendentalists who were trying to develop a commune, like a utopian commune in Harvard, Massachusetts, that they dubbed Fruitlands. And so Fruitlands, a group of these idealists, transcendental idealists, gathered together, had Fruitlands, and their whole intention was to live off the land, to do their own farming without using any animal power, without eating any animals or milk or honey or even cheese, just living off the vegetable matter that they grew at Fruitlands. And unfortunately, it was a very difficult undertaking. They didn't make it any more than 7 months. After 7 months, they abandoned the whole utopian ideal. Joeseph Palmer did buy the site and maintained it as a farm, as far as I know, for a few decades after that. And then eventually Joeseph Palmer lived out his days, I believe, out in Harvard. But anyway, what we've seen, our last thing that we're going to see on this episode of Baystste Backcountry, we've seen where Joeseph Palmer was born. We've seen where he ran his farm as a young and a middle-aged man, and just discussed where he was out in Fruitlands. And what we're going to see next is we're actually going to see where Joeseph Palmer is buried. So I'm going to move on from here and go on to the last and concluding part of our journey. So here we are now in Evergreen Cemetery in the city of Leominster, and we're here at Evergreen because right here in front of me is the gravesite of Joeseph Palmer. So this is the gentleman whose home we saw, his childhood home we saw out in the No Town Woods, and whose adulthood home and farm we also saw in the No Town Woods. After leaving the woods and moving to Fitchburg, he was, as it says right here on his stone, he was persecuted for wearing a beard. And not only was he persecuted, he was jailed. He was jailed for 15 months. It amazes me when I contemplate the intolerance of the people at the time who would put somebody in jail purely for wearing a beard. I'm glad I didn't live back then. But as fate would have it, as he steadfastly maintained his beard, fashion changed, and by the time he died in the mid-1800s, beards had come back, and so he ended up, kind of proving the intolerance wrong. Makes me think of the things that people are intolerant of today and persecute people for things just as silly. But anyway, that's our story for this episode of Baystste Backcountry. This is Bob Tremblay. I look forward to seeing you on the trail for our next episode. Thank you.